My father-in-law said I'd never be good enough for his daughter, so I bought his company and made him beg for his job. I still remember the exact moment everything changed between us, sitting in his pristine living room with its uncomfortable leather furniture and the smell of expensive cologne hanging in the air. He looked at me with those cold eyes, the same ones my wife inherited but somehow made warm and loving, and delivered the words that would fuel my next decade of pure determination. The way he said it wasn't even angry or passionate, just matter of fact, like he was commenting on the weather or discussing what to have for dinner. My hands were shaking slightly as I held the small velvet box, having rehearsed this moment 1,000 times in my head, but nothing could have prepared me for his response. I had come to ask for his blessing to marry his daughter, following what I thought was the respectful, traditional approach that would show him I was serious about his family. Instead, he leaned back in his chair, adjusted his expensive watch, and gave me a look that made me feel like I was 12 years old again, standing in the principal's office. The house itself seemed to mock me that day, with its marble floors and crystal chandeliers, the kind of place where you're afraid to touch anything because it probably costs more than your car. I had grown up in a modest two-bedroom apartment with my single mother, working part-time jobs since I was 15 just to help pay the bills, and walking into that mansion felt like entering a different world entirely. Every detail screamed wealth and privilege, from the imported rugs to the paintings that looked like they belonged in a museum. His daughter and I had been together for 3 years at that point, meeting in college where we both studied business, though our experiences couldn't have been more different. While I worked nights at a local restaurant to pay for my textbooks and lived off ramen noodles, she had a credit card with no limit and a car that was worth more than most people's houses. But none of that mattered to me because she was kind, intelligent, and saw something in me that even I wasn't sure existed at the time. We had talked about marriage for months, planning our future together with the excitement that only young love can bring, discussing everything from where we wanted to live to how many kids we hoped to have someday. She was nervous about introducing me to her father, always making excuses about why the timing wasn't right or how busy he was with work. But I pressed the issue because I wanted to do things properly. I wanted to show him that despite my humble background, I was worthy of his daughter's love and capable of providing for her. The conversation that day started civil enough, with him offering me a drink from his impressive bar collection and asking about my studies, my plans after graduation, and my family background. I answered honestly, perhaps too honestly, telling him about my mother's struggles as a single parent, about working multiple jobs to put myself through school, about my dreams of starting my own business someday. I thought he might respect the work ethic, the determination to build something from nothing, but instead, I watched his expression grow colder with each detail. When I finally worked up the courage to ask for his blessing, pulling out the ring I had saved for 8 months to buy, he barely glanced at it before shaking his head. The ring wasn't much by his standards, probably cost less than one of his dinner parties, but it represented everything I had worked for and every sacrifice I had made. I had researched diamonds for weeks, learned about cuts and clarity and color, wanted to make sure I got her something beautiful even if it wasn't the biggest stone in the world. His response hit me like a physical blow, delivered in that calm, measured tone that somehow made it worse than if he had been shouting. He explained that his daughter deserved better than someone who would always be struggling to make ends meet, someone who could provide her with the lifestyle she was accustomed to, someone who came from the right kind of family with the right connections. The words felt like they were coming from a different century, but he delivered them with such conviction that for a moment I almost believed him. I left that house feeling smaller than I had ever felt in my life, walking to my beat-up Honda Civic while trying to process what had just happened. The ring box felt heavy in my pocket, a reminder of my foolish optimism, and I sat in my car for 20 minutes just staring at the steering wheel. Part of me wanted to drive straight to his daughter, to tell her what her father had said and let her decide whether his opinion mattered, but another part of me wondered if maybe he was right. The doubt crept in slowly at first, like water seeping through a crack in a foundation, making me question everything I thought I knew about myself and my worth. I started noticing things I had never paid attention to before, like how her friends dressed or what kind of restaurants they went to, how casually they talked about vacations to Europe or buying new cars. I began to see the gaps between our worlds more clearly, the invisible barriers that I had been naive enough to think love could overcome. But then something unexpected happened during my lowest moment. Sitting in my tiny apartment eating cereal for dinner because I couldn't afford groceries until my next paycheck. I got angry, not the hot, explosive kind of anger that burns out quickly, but the cold, calculating kind that settles in your bones and changes the way you see everything. I realized that his words weren't just an insult to me. They were an insult to my mother, to every person who had ever worked hard for what they had, to the very idea that worth could be measured by bank account balances. That night, I made a decision that would shape the next decade of my life, pulling out a notebook and writing down everything I knew about his business, every detail his daughter had mentioned in passing, every weakness I had observed during our brief interactions. He owned a mid-sized manufacturing company that had been in the family for generations, the kind of business that had grown comfortable and complacent, coasting on old contracts and established relationships. I spent the next 6 months researching the industry, learning about their competitors, their suppliers, their customers, anything I could find in public records or trade publications. My wife-to-be was confused by my sudden interest in business strategy and market analysis, but I told her I was working on a project for school, which wasn't entirely a lie. I was learning, absorbing information like a sponge, staying up until 3 in the morning reading about corporate acquisitions and hostile takeovers, studying the playbooks of successful entrepreneurs who had built empires from nothing. I discovered that her father's company, while profitable, had several vulnerabilities that a more aggressive competitor could exploit with the right strategy and sufficient capital. After graduation, instead of looking for traditional employment, I took a massive risk and started my own company with a loan from my mother's retirement savings and a business plan that I had refined dozens of times. The first year was brutal, working 18-hour days, living on coffee and determination, sleeping on the office floor more nights than I care to admit. I started small, targeting clients in adjacent industries, building a reputation for reliability and innovation that slowly began to attract attention from bigger players. My girlfriend and I got married without her father's blessing, a small ceremony that felt more like a rebellion than a celebration, but she stood by me despite the family pressure. She believed in me when I barely believed in myself, working her own job while I poured everything into growing the business, never complaining about the sacrifices or the uncertainty. Her father didn't attend the wedding, sending a brief note that managed to be both polite and dismissive, wishing us well while making it clear he expected the marriage to fail within a year. The business grew slowly at first, then faster as we gained momentum and credibility, each success building on the last until we had established ourselves as a serious player in the market. I hired smart people, treated them well, and focused on long-term relationships rather than short-term profits, building the kind of company culture that attracts top talent and keeps them motivated. Within 3 years, we had expanded from my original tiny office to a proper facility with 40 employees and contracts with some of the biggest names in the industry. By year 5, we had grown large enough to start acquiring smaller competitors, rolling up market share and consolidating operations in ways that created significant efficiencies. I had learned that business, at its core, is about solving problems more efficiently than your competitors, and we had become very good at identifying opportunities that others missed. My father-in-law's company was still profitable, but they had lost several major contracts to more agile competitors and were struggling to adapt to changing market conditions. The turning point came during year 7, when a major economic downturn hit the industry hard and exposed the weaknesses in many established companies. Businesses that had relied on legacy relationships and old ways of doing things suddenly found themselves scrambling to survive, while leaner, more adaptable companies like mine were able to not only weather the storm but actually gain market share. I watched from a distance as my father-in-law's company struggled, laying off workers and cutting costs in ways that suggested deeper structural problems. It was around this time that I learned something that changed everything, a piece of information that fell into my lap purely by chance during an industry conference. One of my suppliers mentioned that my father-in-law's company was quietly shopping around for a buyer, trying to find someone willing to take on their debt and keep the business running. The family was apparently split on whether to sell or try to ride out the downturn, but the financial pressure was mounting and they needed to make a decision soon. I spent the next 6 months conducting due diligence through intermediaries, learning everything I could about their financial situation, their assets, their liabilities, and their prospects for recovery. What I discovered was both better and worse than I had expected. A company with solid fundamentals but poor management decisions that had left them vulnerable to exactly the kind of market conditions we were experiencing. They had good people, decent equipment, and valuable contracts, but they were burning through cash and making panic decisions that were only making their situation worse. The acquisition process took another year of careful negotiation, working through lawyers and investment bankers to structure a deal that would give me control of the company while minimizing my financial exposure. I had to bring in outside investors and take on significant debt, but the numbers worked if I could execute the turnaround plan I had developed. The beautiful irony was that my father-in-law had no idea who was behind the acquisition until the final documents were signed, thinking he was dealing with a private equity firm that would keep the existing management team in place. The day I walked into his office, as the new owner was worth every sleepless night and every moment of doubt I had experienced over the previous 8 years. He was sitting behind his massive mahogany desk, probably the same one where he had made the decision to dismiss me all those years ago, and his face went through a series of expressions that I will remember for the rest of my life. First confusion, then recognition, then a kind of stunned disbelief that gradually transformed into something approaching respect. I had prepared for this moment carefully, thinking through exactly what I wanted to say and how I wanted to handle the transition. Part of me wanted to gloat, to throw his words back in his face and make him feel as small as he had made me feel that day in his living room. But I had learned that true power comes not from humiliation, but from control, from being able to choose mercy when you could just as easily choose revenge. Instead, I offered him a choice, explaining that I was planning to restructure the company and that would mean significant changes in leadership and operations. I could either terminate his employment immediately with a standard severance package, or he could stay on as a consultant at a reduced salary while I implemented the changes necessary to save the business. The choice was his, but either way, I would be making the decisions about the future of the company that had been in his family for 3 generations. Watching him process this information was fascinating in a way that I hadn't expected. Seeing the man who had once dismissed me as unworthy now having to confront the reality that I held his professional future in my hands. He asked a few questions about my plans, about the employees, about the company's future, and I could see him struggling to reconcile the young man he had rejected with the successful businessman sitting across from him. The conversation was surreal, almost like a role reversal from that day 8 years earlier when I had been the supplicant seeking his approval. He chose to stay, swallowing whatever pride he had left and accepting the consulting role, probably because he needed the income and knew that finding another position at his age would be nearly impossible. Over the following months, I watched him adapt to being an employee rather than an owner, taking direction from me and others, learning new systems and processes that I implemented to modernize the operation. It was educational for both of us, though I suspect his education was more uncomfortable than mine. The turnaround was successful beyond my most optimistic projections, combining the best elements of both companies while eliminating redundancies and inefficiencies that had been holding back growth. We retained most of the workforce, improved working conditions, and actually expanded operations within 2 years of the acquisition. My father-in-law proved to be more adaptable than I had expected, bringing valuable industry knowledge and relationships that helped smooth the transition and maintain customer confidence. The most surprising development was how our relationship evolved during this period, transforming from antagonistic to something approaching mutual respect. He began to understand that my success wasn't just luck or timing, but the result of careful planning, hard work, and smart decision-making, qualities that he had failed to recognize in me years earlier. I began to see him not as the villain of my story, but as a man who had been protecting his daughter in the only way he knew how, using the metrics that made sense in his world. My wife watched this transformation with a mixture of amusement and relief, happy that two of the most important men in her life had found a way to coexist without the constant tension that had defined our early relationship. She had never asked me to choose between her and her father, but I knew the situation had been difficult for her, caught between her love for me and her loyalty to her family. Seeing us work together professionally, even in this unusual context, gave her a kind of peace that I hadn't realized she was missing. The business continued to grow over the next few years, expanding into new markets and developing innovative products that established us as a leader in the industry. My father-in-law's knowledge and connections proved invaluable during this expansion, helping us navigate regulatory challenges and build relationships with key customers. What had started as a power play gradually became a genuine partnership, though one where the roles were clearly defined and the hierarchy was never in doubt. Looking back now, I realize that his initial rejection was probably the best thing that could have happened to me, providing the motivation and focus that I needed to build something significant. Without that burning desire to prove him wrong, I might have settled for a comfortable middle management position somewhere, working for someone else, and never discovering what I was capable of achieving. His words had stung, but they had also awakened something in me that I didn't know existed, a hunger for success that went beyond money or status. The relationship with my wife deepened during this period as well, strengthened by the challenges we had overcome together and the shared experience of building something meaningful from nothing. She had seen me at my lowest point, when I doubted everything about myself and my future, and she had chosen to believe in me anyway. Watching her father gradually come to respect and even admire what I had accomplished was validation not just for me, but for her faith in me during those difficult early years. My father-in-law and I still work together today, though the dynamic has evolved considerably from those early days of awkward adjustment. He has become something of a mentor in areas where his experience exceeds mine, while I have taken the lead on strategic decisions and long-term planning. We've learned to leverage each other's strengths while compensating for our respective weaknesses, creating a partnership that is more effective than either of us could be alone. The company we built together has become something neither of us could have achieved independently, combining his industry knowledge and relationships with my strategic vision and operational skills. We've created hundreds of jobs, contributed to the local economy, and built something that will outlast both of us. It's not the revenge I had originally imagined, but it's something better, a transformation that benefited everyone involved rather than just settling old scores. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if he had given me his blessing that day, if he had welcomed me into the family with open arms and treated me as an equal from the beginning. Would I have been satisfied with a traditional career path, content to be a good son-in-law and a steady provider? Or would I have eventually found my way to entrepreneurship anyway, driven by some internal need to build and create rather than just participate in someone else's vision? I'll never know the answer to that question, but I've made peace with the path that brought me here, understanding that sometimes the obstacles we face are exactly what we need to become the people we're meant to be. My father-in-law's rejection forced me to dig deeper than I knew I could, to find reserves of determination and creativity that might have remained dormant under easier circumstances. It taught me that worth isn't determined by where you start, but by how far you're willing to go to reach your destination. The story has become something of a family legend now, told at holiday gatherings and business events as an example of how initial impressions can be wrong and how persistence can overcome seemingly impossible odds. My father-in-law tells it with a self-deprecating humor that suggests he's learned something from the experience, acknowledging that he almost lost out on having a son-in-law who would not only make his daughter happy, but also help secure his own financial future in ways he never could have imagined. My children will grow up hearing this story, learning that rejection and failure are not the end of the road, but potentially the beginning of something better. They'll understand that their grandfather's initial assessment was wrong, but they'll also learn that proving someone wrong is less important than proving something to yourself. The real victory wasn't in making him beg for his job, but in discovering that I was capable of far more than either of us had believed possible. The business continues to thrive today, having survived multiple economic cycles and industry changes through careful planning and adaptation. My father-in-law still comes to work every day, no longer as an owner but as a valued member of the team, contributing his expertise while learning new approaches to old problems. We've built something together that neither of us could have created alone, a legacy that will benefit our family and our employees for generations to come. Looking back on that day in his living room, I can almost thank him for his harsh words, understanding now that they were exactly what I needed to hear to unlock my potential. Without his rejection, I might never have discovered the drive and determination that lay dormant within me, might never have learned that the only person who gets to define your worth is you. His assessment of my prospects was wrong, but his challenge to prove myself was exactly what I needed to become the man I was meant to be.